What were some examples of something you wish you had done?
Made more time to do things that he wanted to do, and learn to appreciate them.
That is Bill Weber, the final guest for Season 1 of The Journey of Realizing Empathy. In today's episode, you'll hear Bill share the story of when he struggled to empathize with his twin brother. Not an easy topic to discuss in a public forum. He also shares the journey he's gone through to realize empathy with people in Japan and China, as well as the African American community in the US. Join me in holding space for Bill to reflect honestly. Welcome to the journey of realizing empathy. I think we all have experienced a moment in our lives when we suddenly empathize with somebody we previously did not by experiencing a moment of realization. One where we went, aha, oh, or maybe even burst out with laughter concerning something we either did not or had incorrectly assumed to understand and appreciate enough. While these realizations can sometimes be had in a few minutes, it can also take years. In fact, it may never happen. It is a seemingly simple yet complex and lifelong process of realizing empathy that I wish to explore in all of our episodes. Hey there, listener. My name is Slim. I help startup founders in their maturation as a leader and a CEO by helping them confront themselves in a true mirror. And I believe few things serve as a truer mirror than the challenges we face in our interactions with other people. The Journey of Realizing Empathy is a show where we explore how our challenges with other people can ultimately serve as a true mirror that helps us mature as leaders and human beings. In each of our episodes, we host a guest who tells a story of a time in their life when they struggled to empathize with one or more people until a series of realizations moved them to empathize with those very people. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Slim. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Would you be willing to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, you'll learn a lot more about me through this interview, but to keep it simple, I'm a proud father of 2 adult kids. In my second marriage, I'm the stepfather of a 10-year-old now, and I have 2 grandkids. I had a long career with DuPont up until about 5 years ago, so now I'm in the next chapter of life after a very fulfilling career. But look forward to having this discussion with you and sharing some of the learnings that I've had so far on this topic.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure that I personally acknowledge how much I appreciate your willingness to be on the show, because I believe we live in a time where in some ways empathy has become politicized and weaponized. So it's far easier to talk about how much empathy we have as opposed to talk about times when we struggled to empathize. So in some ways, I believe the gesture that you've shown me in accepting the invitation is perhaps a small yet very significant step in exercising the courage and bravery that I believe is required to make some real progress about this. So thank you.
You're quite welcome. It's a two-way street. Once you get comfortable realizing where you can improve in empathy, you realize how much you want to stay in touch with opportunities to empathize.
Absolutely. Cannot agree more. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I wanted to ask, what relationship do you believe we'll be focusing on today?
I actually have 3 different chapters in my life that I want to get at. Literally the very first chapter, which is the relationship with my twin brother. So literally from day one, he is the first relationship in my life and been there for 61 years now. The second chapter is fast forwarding 30 years. So my midlife being between 30 and 50 and some of the impact my particular career had on this topic of empathy. And then the last chapter gets back to a personal one again and has to do with my current marriage, which is interracial marriage. My wife's African American, and it has another set of opportunities and challenges on this topic that have keep me fresh on staying aware of this topic in my life.
I suppose the key word is beginner's mindset, as we all call it.
Yes.
All right, great. So take us back to wherever you believe we should start the story.
So my twin, his name is Ed. He knows I'm describing this relationship. And the important part to note is that we are twins, but most people usually think of identical twins. You look alike, act alike, think alike. The other option is a fraternal twin. And Ed and I are about as fraternal as you can get, in that I had dark hair, he had blonde hair. I had brown eyes, he had blue eyes. I love sports, he didn't like sports. He's very artsy, very good with his hands, very creative. I ended up being an engineer. We're very different, and not just skills, but personality traits. So I am a change agent at heart. I love change. I love new situations. I seek them out. He is almost 180 degrees from that. He likes plan. He likes predictability, routine. He still lives very close to where we were born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and has traveled out of that state only a few times. And in my career, I was traveling the world for 30 years. We couldn't be more different.
Wow.
We're the youngest of 8. We're the last 2 of 8 kids. So we grew up in a big family. In any big family, you have a variety of personalities. So you realize not everybody is the same. But given that, despite that, I should say, when you're a twin, every day you're being compared. And every day it's like, you're not alike. Oh, you do this better than that. Like in sports, he actually has a more athletic physique than me, but I love sports and he hated them. So if we did something as a family that happened to be throwing a football or whatever, I would be better at it. But if you were better, you didn't want the other guy to be pointed out as being the one that was deficient. And as a 5-year-old, my mom was an art teacher. So sometimes there would be these little craft activities and I'd be sitting there just looking at the rocks. Maybe I could throw it. I don't really want to make anything with it, but here's a couple of eyes. And then it'd be like, oh, I'm not as good at this as him. So we acknowledged it, but from an empathy point of view, back to your key word, and we'll get to the other chapters. I don't think I really internalized how to be able to truly walk in his shoes, probably till I was in my 30s, to where I could be acknowledging where I hurt him unintentionally. I think that was a key part. You know, I would be much more comfortable in a situation just saying, yeah, we're not the same or whatever, but I wouldn't necessarily step out of my shoes and put myself in his shoes. And I just really wouldn't have acknowledged his perspective on a given situation.
I mean, I think the striking thing that I'm sensing based on the way you've described your relationship and the kind of the context or the situation in which you both grow up, I sense a lot of care in how you feel towards your brother. So I'm very curious. It wasn't like you didn't care about this person. You obviously did care very much about this person. At the same time, I'm very curious about the contrast. So before you hit that 30s, where you start to begin to realize that you hadn't put yourself in his shoes, what were some things that you can talk about that would give us some contrast?
Some contrast
to how it was different, how the way you approached the relationship, how you felt in the relationship were different before the realizations.
I think as opposed to tolerating our differences, it was able to finally get more to a point of appreciating the differences. I think,
what are some things you tolerated?
As soon as we could have choices of things, he loved little matchbox cars and would make a city and have all these cars. And if I had a car, because we always had the same birthday, we each may get 3 cars.
That's right.
And I would be like, here, Ed, you can have my cars. So it was just that we knew the other person just didn't want to do the same things as us. And so therefore you tolerated it, and it wasn't good or bad, but we had different friends as we grew up.
Sure.
In grade school, I had some buddies, Mike and other people, that loved to throw a ball after school every day. And he had Bob and other guys that liked artsy craftsy stuff, or cowboys and Indians, or whatever. It was like migrating to different lives and then coming back. Oh, there you are again. Morning, noon, and night, because we slept in the same room and ate at the same table, obviously, and all the rest. But
so in some ways, because of the differences that you had, were you in different social circles? So in some ways, you didn't have a lot of interactions. Is that what you mean?
we didn't have, it was bipolar. We had interactions when it was family gatherings, but if it was outside of family, we just had and it actually ended up, because of other circumstances, by even grade school, we ended up in different grades, different levels grades.
How did that happen?
He had some health issues in the first grade with pneumonia and mono and things, that he missed so much school that it brought him back. And then later I ended up skipping a grade going into high school. So we actually ended up 2 grades apart.
Oh, that would have been a significant difference, especially when you're little kids.
Yes. And again, it wasn't, because for our relationship, we still liked each other. Even before we went to school, we didn't really do the same thing. But yes, the number of times people would say, "That's your twin, but he's in a different kind." Yeah. I know.
Could have been annoying, no?
Annoying, frustrating, kind of tiring to get back to the same. And that's where that part of it was like, and I don't know if he would describe it the same way, like death of 1,000 cuts. Just, we're very different. You're right. Ha ha ha. It's very predictable. The sort of first 4 questions you're going to get after they find out you're a twin, and then say, "And who is your twin?" Then it's like very predictable. The next 3 or 4 things that are going to be said.
Why this, why that? So let's humanize this a little bit more, because even if you're not a twin, even in situations, there's like the first and the second and the third and all that kind of stuff, there are a lot of comparisons. Like, oh, she's the smart one, he's the athletic one, he's the fill in the blank kind of a thing. And a lot of the comparison can be tiring, can also lead to self-judgment. There's a lot of different mixture of emotions that can conjure up in people. I'm curious, so in a twin situation, I can imagine that being amplified, who knows how many more folds, because of the fact that people expect you to be quote unquote the same, right?
The one big counter is, and I don't know if it was because it was a large family or just the dynamics of our family, but I think it would have been very different if we were the only 2 kids, and now with 8 kids and a family of 10. Again, there was always stuff going on. And part of the differences were he was more inclined to be around a couple of the siblings, and I was more inclined to be around a couple of the other siblings, because with that many,
village,
you got to pack, and everybody.
Got it. So I'm curious. So back then, what were some emotions that you experienced as another twin, being confronted with these sort of predictable questions and comparisons?
Oftentimes it would be guilt, because if we were being compared on something that I was better at, it would be like, why do people have to make such a big deal out of this? Me, he's him. But that to me is not empathy. That was more back to genuinely caring about them, right? There are other emotions that come with this part of the journey later in life that I think got me to get beyond those caring emotions and get into the seeing what he has that's different than me, that is additive. Back to the saying that I like, getting non-dualistic, that as opposed to his way or my perspective, and shifting it from being either or to both and, his perspective and my perspective.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I didn't get to that. I'm still synthesizing it, but that kind of light bulb didn't go off until, like I said, my 30s and beyond.
Yeah. What other emotions besides guilt do you remember feeling back then?
Genuine love. That was always there. Let me think if I can. At times there would be, you have a couple here that are good, anxiety or dread or embarrassment. There would be ones that, depending on the situation, especially if it was a guard situation, a lot of times we would know we'd be into something where we were going to have different reactions. And then other times it would be something that would come up very urgent and it'd be like, oh, geez, I know it's coming next.
What's an example of something like that?
Like probably going to a family reunion of a type where there would be people there were certain family reunions where it was truly extended family. So as people got to know us, they always appreciate it. But then there's that next layer of family reunion where you're going to go through all those same things again of, oh, you're the twins. Oh, what do you do? What does he do? Oh, blah, 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 blah. So that's when like the anxiety and dread would come up. Okay, here we go again. This is going to be dragging us through this again.
And was the anxiety about not knowing what to say, or what were some of the anxieties about?
Just knowing that there's likely going to be uncomfortable moments and you're probably not going to avoid it. And let's slog through these next rounds of questions that they're going to come up with and
how frequent were these?
A family reunion kind of example would be a couple times a year for those bigger kind of gatherings that would happen around big holidays. But again, when it's a twin and you're around them every day, there's a lot of micro situations.
Yeah. I would also imagine, if I remember back to being a kid, as much as I'm sure our parents love these family reunions because they're getting back with their own siblings, I think from a children's perspective, it's, do I really have to go to these kind of a thing? And then now you're adding an extra layer above that, which is not only that kind of dread, but they're going to also drill us with questions that'll make us even more uncomfortable. Is that the kind of magnitude?
Yes.
So we were talking about the contrast between when you had the realization and what it was like before when you were growing up. And the biggest thing that came up so far was the comparison and these family unions and micro gatherings. Were there anything else besides that?
Back to that word of tolerance versus appreciation. When I talk about tolerating his differences or realizing I wouldn't be able to convince him that my perspective was right. And then later, from an appreciation point of view, learning to accept his perspective as one that was different and additive to mine.
What did you try to convince him that you're right about?
Oh, everything.
Everything.
Just why we should play sports or something instead of staying inside and playing with cards. Or I've always been high strung, an achiever, a doer. He'll tell you, my mom would say, okay, somebody's got to take out the garbage. And he would stay quiet because I couldn't wait 3 seconds, say, okay, I'll do it. Here I go.
Hey.
Oh,
wow.
No, because also it's always a package deal with the kids. So she also got out of me because I've always been inquisitive. I was the one that was from a young age, but never stopped with why. And she told me in a painfully honest moment when I was a teenager or older of, Bill, thank God you were the last one, because if you would have been the first, I wouldn't have had 8 kids. So I'd like to explain to Ed, why are you asking all those questions? Oh, Ed, you got to understand, you need to get at the... So even that, I would be trying to explain my position on things. So Ed has always been much more passive and tolerant of a strong personality, i.e. me, right? So...
Got it. Okay. So fast forward a little bit more after your 30s. What happened? What were the impetus behind these realizations you had?
I think it was the opportunity to get out of my cocoon. I went away to college. Again, I was seeking change. So I didn't apply to any in Cincinnati. I had the opportunity to go outside. And then I was young, but I went straight to work for DuPont. So I turned 21 in April of my senior year, got my chemical engineering degree in May, and started working for DuPont in June. Moved me to the East Coast with DuPont.
Where was it in the East Coast?
Delaware is their corporate headquarters. So just outside of Philly. So I did well there early, but especially about 10 years in, when I got into general management, I started running global businesses. So in 1990, I still remember, so I would have been 30, was my first job running a global business, my first travel to Japan. And that last 25 years of my career, I was running global businesses and traveling a lot to other parts of the world. And not surprisingly, as you get exposed to blatant cultural differences, and you get a chance to live and be in that culture as opposed to viewing it on a screen. And as you're trying to do business, which means you're trying to build a relationship with customers and suppliers and partners, and you realize English often is a second language. So you start learning body language and cultural norms and these things that start making empathy good business also start then getting into your persona and say, oh, this, I don't have all the answers, and my culture and norms and all the rest aren't automatically the best. And yes, I can see where the Eastern influence is distinctive and additive to the Western influence. And I can see where Buddhism is distinctive and additive to Catholicism. And I can see where, I can see where my twin brother's view on things is a little bit distinctive and additive.
How did that connection happen from like Buddhism and Eastern culture to your brother?
I think it's just because once you, at least for me, once you've had an opportunity to rewire your muscle memory. So as opposed to the West, where, and again, it is more Western, especially US, self-actualized, self-accomplished, self-determined. It's all about me and I'm going to get it right. And that's one of the key things I learned with Japan. Japan, to me, is the country I've been to that is the most different from the US, because as opposed to the US, where it's all about me, and oh yeah, I live in Virginia, and oh yeah, it's part of the US. In Japan, I'm a Japanese, and oh yeah, I live in Tokyo, and oh yeah, my name is Hashimoto-san. It's just so different that once you start rewiring how you handle differences in perspective on things, and you don't start with why is mine, why should I listen to yours, but you start with how are we going to relate, and therefore based on that common bond, how is my difference to yours both part of that whole? For me, it just kind of was like a flower, like opening up, just realizing, oh my gosh, if I can just get out of my head and do a better job of listening to learn, as opposed to listening to win or listening to fix, because those were always, my lever has always been listening to fix. It's always been, because I do care about people. I always want to improve a situation. So when I'm listening, and I've already done it with you, I interrupt a lot. It's not because I don't want to hear it, because I'm trying to say, oh, I can help fix that. And sometimes it's listen to win. Here's my opinion. I want it. But to really slow down enough, it's hard for me. I've been working on it now consciously for 30 years to listen to learn and listen to just hear the untold message and what's behind it from the person that's giving it. That's a whole new muscle to exercise.
Yeah.
And so once I had to do it for business, it just carried over, and I realized, why haven't I been doing this with Ed?
Give us some anecdotes about, like, in a business context, with situations where you realize it would be very important for you to listen to learn as opposed to listen to win or fix.
Well, especially in Japan, they will almost never say no. And in Japanese, hi is yes. And in a discussion, I fell into the early trap that everybody does when you're doing business in Japan. As you're having your discussions being translated, and the Japanese keep saying hi, hi, hi. They're not agreeing. They're just saying, it's their way of saying I'm listening without any judgment. And at the end, and if you say, so do we have a deal? And they go, This is very difficult. That's their way of saying, no friggin' way. We're never going to do it.
It's very
But
difficult.
they'll never say that to your face. So again, learning that, and then, but to get that, and the beauty is, to me, and part of the new muscles, the exercise, as I call it, in listening, is that even though everything's done in English, you really need to be much more sensitive to body language and things, because when you're working through a translator, you're only getting part of the message, but you can just see so much more message getting into what their culture is and what their mannerisms are and all the rest. So it just starts forcing you to really put yourself in the other person's shoes. And then you just triggered a memory that came up from China. And I was blessed because with DuPont, I was always going over as the big DuPont guy, and DuPont was a respected global company. And we had nationals in all these foreign offices. So I rarely went by myself. I would go to China, the local native Chinese national would pick me up at the Beijing airport, and we'd make the visits. But one of the more impactful things for me to just understand and appreciate empathy, back on this topic, and how it gets you down deeper into the personal perspective on things, is on one of my trips to Beijing, working with the local counterpart from DuPont. We had our calls. The weekend was free, and they're always great hosts. When an American goes over there, always like, well, let's go do something this weekend. So he was about my age, and we went to Forbidden City in Beijing, and it was great. But then we have lunch, and it's just the two of us, and he starts getting into his life story, which was growing up through the Cultural Revolution, and telling me about his parents. One was in the town office, one was in the university. When the fourth grade, they get sent off for re-education. Next 12 years, he's basically, the whole country is in suspended animation, and he comes out at 19 or 20, basically still with the fourth grade education, and now getting back to learning. So you just hear the life story that, over here was a history book that we read a little bit, a paragraph about Cultural Revolution, trying to remember a date for a test. But when you get over there and get able to talk to somebody about what it was in their experience and why it impacts how they behave in a business situation with me, when you get those opportunities to see the rest of the story from somebody else's perspective, you just realize how many times you haven't been intentional enough on listening to learn, as opposed to listening to fix or listening to win. Americans, usually it's listening to win.
So I want to go a little bit deeper. First of all, what emotions do you remember feeling when you heard those stories about him sharing his family and all that kind of history?
So a range, a little bit of sorrow and all for what he had to go through. Definitely a layer of camaraderie, appreciation, a layer of love, of just the fact that he was willing to share it with me, because could have just been a polite business relationship. And probably, again, a little bit of that, what you started off this call with, sort of that aha, just sort of a little bit of that, my God, this is a big world. And my God, there's so many facets to it that I have yet to understand, and yet to really piece together, which is, I think, why I've always been wired, not good at empathy, but I've been wired to be better at it, as opposed to being like, oh no, don't ask me to understand. Because back to what I said, I always have been curious, inquisitive, and a why. So I've always found God for me partly through people and what I learned from other people, even though I'm not good at listening to learn as much as I should be. There's definitely a piece of me that just starts with, I should be doing it, and I should be doing it better. And that is definitely a nature part of me, that the nurture part of me is trying to do better. And I think Ed, my twin, that is not his nature. I think he's a good listener, but it's not starting from I don't think he has that same, oh, I got to understand it all. He's very comfortable with his view, which is also fine. And I appreciate that not everybody has to be the prober.
I'm also very curious because you mentioned love, and you went on to say just the willingness of him sharing a personal story with you where it could have been just a polite business conversation. Yeah. What's the significance of going to China and hearing somebody who was willing to share their personal story instead of making just a polite conversation?
I just think it's the depth of a true relationship when somebody's willing to be vulnerable. Right? Is, to me, an essential element to a trusted relationship. And I try to practice being proactively vulnerable, because I both have, the current wife would probably say I'm a little bit naive, and that I am inherently trusting of other people. But my experience has always been, if I am willing to be proactively vulnerable, it usually pays great dividends. And especially in my experience in DuPont, as my career proceeded and I became more of an uppity up leader up the ranks, it actually became a bigger asset, because as you have more perceived power, I found it even more important that you be willing to be vulnerable, because those that view you in the power context are far less likely to give you their honest opinions and honest efforts and honest critique if it's being kept at that quote unquote professional level without admitting you don't have it all figured out already.
It's the proverbial naked king, right?
Yeah. And I've always enjoyed, I always like good to great, and I've always tried to practice being a servant leader. So it also is in that element of being, if you're going to be a servant leader, you got to be comfortable with putting yourself second to the mission of the organization and the group. And many times that also definitely means putting your ego second. And oftentimes it means, here's my idea, but just because I'm the leader doesn't mean it's the best idea. Because there's plenty of things I haven't been able to think through. And I was blessed because in DuPont, I was often surrounded by a lot of really smart people. My job wasn't to have the best idea. My job was to help the best idea emerge out of the group and get them to slow down enough to listen to each other. That's the other thing to me about empathy is it's not just me. There's a whole nother layer of how do you nurture the appreciation of empathy, which in now's language, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's some of the secret sauce of the inclusion aspect of that, getting beyond diversity, not just mixing different personalities together, but how do you get that layer of trust? And empathy it's not a luxury, it's a prerequisite. If you can't get people to empathize, you'll never get inclusion.
Right. And like to your point about trust, talk about cross-cultural, even in the same culture, maybe even in the same department, maybe even the same team, with the same exact people who look exactly like one another. There are times when empathy is difficult, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. At moments of crisis, at moments of loss, when your emotions are most afraid. Yeah. So don't get me wrong in all this. It's not like I got it all figured out.
No.
I just trying to be more present to it and aware to it and intentional about working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as you're going across culture and meeting these people and forming not just business relationships, but personal relationships with these people, realizing that these people are also, it sounds so obvious and kind of cliche to say this, but there is this moment where you realize that they're also human, not just a business partner or somebody we do transactions with. There's a whole human being with their entire history and generations of all that stuff going on, where they bring who they are in that totality into the kind of the business. As you go through these experiences, were there specific moments in which you reflected on the particular relationship you had with your fraternal twin brother?
No, I don't think that there was a nirvana kind of event that made me click and say, oh, I need to talk to Ed. Because again, in our family, our internal family behavior as far as being in contact is literally talking a few times a year.
Yeah.
It's not just the way my current wife and ex-wife and others I know, it's like they talk every week, no matter, where they are. Our family was always close. We always, when we were together, we're fine, but not out of sight, out of mind. But there wasn't that, oh, I got to pick up the phone and talk.
Yeah. Just different cultures, different family cultures. Yeah.
Yes.
So progress the story for me. How did all those experiences eventually impact your relationship with your brother?
As we would get together, would it be with family gatherings, whether it was at a Christmas or family reunion of our family, we had a different type of conversation where it was more just being able, not expecting them to
that you're right,
but just understanding what's going on in your life. How do you feel about it? And to learn, right? Listening for what's important to them and why, and letting that be enough.
So in some ways,
big change for me.
So in some ways, you were slowly changing in your professional life. And that almost became not just you in a professional setting, but it became who you want to be in general.
Yeah, yes. And part of that is because I think from my father, I always had a very high personal standard for being authentic and having high integrity. So in my corporate career, I didn't separate professional from personal. I've always really strived to be 100% authentic, transparent, consistent, integrated. So as I was exposed because of my professional responsibilities to learn the value of listening, to learn that as long as you're an integrated whole and you're not trying to be one person during the day and another person at night, who cares whether the change happened in your personal life or the change happened at the business setting or in a church setting or on the ball diamond or wherever it was, as long as you are able to synthesize it and use it.
So what did you learn from listening to your brother?
His peace and his priority and choice of having that predictable, routine, less chaotic lifestyle, and just being able to have confidence that he knew what to expect at the next moment. And that is something I'm learning to do in very small ways now that I'm in a quasi stage of retirement. I haven't worked for DuPont for 6 years, and I am getting a pension, but the phrase I use is I'm not retiring, I'm rewiring, because I just can't sit on my hands. I can't play golf 5 times a week. So I got a lot of different things that I dabble and do, but I am getting better at practicing some of his priorities for finding chunks of my day that are set aside actually for me and not about doing a lot, but having some, quote, what people call quality time, making time for grandkids and other things that weren't necessarily as managed when I was running global businesses and all.
When you say well managed, meaning?
As much time for the unschedulable, even though it's not a word, quality moments, especially with kids and all, because I did a decent job, but if Ed were my kid's father, he definitely would have had shared more of those unanticipated quality moments that come up as you are with kids, because he wouldn't have been trying to squeeze 5 other things in on top of raising a family.
So that was sort of also a difference in behavior that you witnessed.
Yeah. I think learning to do a better job of being more Edish and slowing down to appreciate the other person. Ed's got a great laugh. I'm trying to think of a persona. Oh, do you know the Flintstones?
Yeah.
Do you know Barney?
Yeah.
Rubble? Just kind of a happy, that's Ed. He's happy. He's got his, he doesn't need to be Fred, bam, doing all his things, that sidekick, but he's always happy. And I ask him to be up leading the band, but he's happy to cheer it along.
What kind of conversations did you have to get to the point where you started to appreciate these aspects?
I think it was just saying, how are you doing? And why do you feel that way? And I affirm that. I don't have that same view on things, but that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. It's only in the last 20 years that we're just like the old I'm okay, you're okay, but really meaning it and acknowledging the differences and enjoying the differences. And as he watches this, he'll probably say, I could do a better job of being direct about saying what I've learned from him. But I think he already knows some of it, but we'll probably have a follow-up discussion after he hears how you've pulled this out of me.
But it sounds like one of the most important things is the kind of the unscheduled, serendipitous quality time that you also now are choosing to spend with your family members. Is that right?
Oh, family and friends. Yeah. Again, part of it is, I think, a typical, a lot of us older retired professionals realize is I don't need another title on a business card, but I'll never regret making time for a heartfelt call to a sibling or an old college friend or some of my old friends that I haven't seen in 20 years from China and India and other places I've traveled. I just have had a very interesting series of discussions with a good friend named Jim that from Taiwan that talking about U.S. China challenges in Taiwan, how it's impacting him and his family and all the rest. And that's somebody I haven't worked with in 20 years, but the relationship was there, and the issues that matter to his heart are ones we enjoy sharing time to talk about.
So I'm curious. So if I were to visualize what you're going through the way I would think about it, it almost sounds like in the past there was something far in the distance that you saw, and getting to that point was very important. But it sounds like in contrast, it's not that's no longer important. It's just that now you see exactly what's right in front of you in the present moment.
Yeah.
And you also appreciate and genuinely want to pay attention to those with the same level of weight that you might have put on the things in the far distance that you could eventually reach. Does that resonate?
It resonates. I wouldn't contrast it as a black and white stark difference as much as several shades of gray of being much more intentional about making time to be present in the full capital letters of being present. I do spend conscious time with centering prayer, meditation. Try to spend conscious time in nature, conscious time being back with friends and all. And again, part of it is the privilege of not working 60 hours a week, running global businesses and waking up every morning worrying about quarterly earnings. You don't, in a corporate career, any career, but especially corporate America, you don't realize how much of not just your conscious, but subconscious gets hijacked by the unending of more and more, quicker. I haven't turned all that off. It's still pieces of it are there, but I am definitely in a very different stage of, back to what you were saying, not having to spend as much of my conscious and unconscious time on the big, hairy, audacious goals, and can actually slow down to smell the roses, so to speak.
Yeah. And exactly like you said, mentioned, it's not an either or. Now it's an and.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's neither. Right?
Yeah.
Where this new thing arises. And when you reflect on that lesson, if we were to call it, that you learned from listening to Ed over the years and starting to not only put yourself in his shoe, now you're also embodying some of that as you become who you are in a very new sense. What emotions would you feel?
I would say more being at peace with being at peace. Because again, my nature is so much being a driver and achiever and one of my sisters was famous for telling me when I was, 7, 8, 9 years old, Bill, you have to be less human doing and more human being. That definitely is me. So just that ability to again, be present, not turning off, trying to accomplish things, but being present in the moment is, and to me, empathy and being present are related, not identical, interconnected, is something that I have the luxury of being able to be more intentional about these days.
So equanimity, being at peace with being at peace. What else? What other emotions?
I think there are, more instances of, and I think it probably goes along with the slowing down, awe and wonder, just being able to appreciate how amazing each day is. If you can insulate yourself from the noise and connect to the essence. And finding, don't want to just say harmony, but it actually has elements of almost ecstasy to it. It's just when you can really feel connected in a multi-dimensional kind of way without having all the answers, but being able to enjoy being in the question and the awe and the wonder of how big that question is, and the fact that you are getting little glimpses of part of the answer, but you're not worried about having all the answer. It's a really good place to be.
It almost sounds, because you were talking earlier about how the nature part of you has that inquisitiveness, that insatiable curiosity. It almost sounds like the listening to your brother, in some ways, he acted as a mirror. And in doing so, it actually helped you more integrate who you are, the person who actually genuinely and naturally desires curiosity, awe, and wonder, and all those things, but make it even broader and make it even more integrated fully and wholly, perhaps. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. But you synthesized a lot of what I was trying to say much more eloquently than me. But yeah, I think you're right in that Ed, in many ways, is a mirror image of me. And once you get comfortable trying to integrate a mirror image, you create something that is more whole.
Yeah.
Richard Rohr, who's a very famous Franciscan priest that talks about men's spirituality, talks about your shadow self. And the idea of needing to be aware, honor, but not run away from your shadow self, which is the polar aspects or mirroring aspects of what your natural tendencies are.
And earlier you had also mentioned the difficulty of, or just in general, just coming to terms or awareness of how you had unintentionally hurt your brother. Would you be willing to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and it'll get to our third chapter. Anytime, at least for me, that I realize that I have been part of the problem, whether by acts of commission or omission, so whether based on things I did or things I didn't do that I could have done, for me, yes, there's always a layer of, and everything else that goes along with it. Guilt, shame, can be humiliation, regret. There's a whole range of that pool of emotions that gets into the learning that, oh, geez, that's something that I did that I really wish I hadn't. And at times, again, it's just not always the things I did, it's the things that I didn't do that I could have done.
What were some examples of something you wish you had done?
Made more time to do things that he wanted to do. And learn to appreciate them, even for a small period. I don't want to become his clone, but just like being able to learn by going to the opposite end of the world, Japan and China, and be able to not necessarily walk in their shoes, but a chance to understand, be intentional about understanding from their perspective. I had plenty of opportunities in the first 18 years of my life and opportunities since to go back and do it. And I haven't made that a priority.
And I would imagine, once again, I think the interesting and fascinating irony of the situation, as you point out, is because you naturally have that curiosity and wonder, it just so happens when in the cross-cultural context that really blossomed. But I think family is one of those interesting relationships where it's so close and somehow it's the most difficult
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
it's
think
not by choice, right?
it is not.
You inherit your family. You don't choose them.
Yeah. And not only that, but I think it's because it's so close. I think when you grow up, whether you naturally expect or just nurturally expect, but it's the place where you most want love, appreciation, belonging,
Affirmation,
and
right?
Validation, every single one of those, in some ways from every single member of your family. Does that resonate?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know if it helps or hurts. In a big family, you aren't going to ever please all the people all the time. But the good news is, because there's so many people, it happens, but it's less likely that frictional relationship, if it's the only sibling and there's only two of you, it's hard to get away from it. But the beauty of, in a big family, you have a little bit of friction, you can let it go and go be with the others and then come back. But yes, no, even now, it's amazing. And I'm sure you have sensed the same thing. Even though I'm 61, when we get together, I get treated like I'm still that 8-year-old and what my role in the family is supposed to be. And everybody's had those discussions, how it's like you're in suspended animation once you get away from home and then you come back for the quote unquote reunions. It's everybody assumes you are exactly like they remembered.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I'm hearing in between the lines is, as a twin, I can imagine that you really wanted your twin to understand what you wanted to enjoy and what you wanted to do with this person. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is probably that extra layer as a twin. I hadn't thought about it till you just worded it that way, that not that it was a matter of convincing that my way was right, as much as wouldn't it be nice if we could actually enjoy the same thing? There is a little bit of sadness that goes with that. It's like, you know what? We're probably never going to really enjoy the same thing, not to the core. Again, little glimpses of it. I can enjoy 15 minutes, an hour, what he would actually, and vice versa. He's tolerating some of the things that I enjoy. But yeah, so I guess that there's a little bit of sadness or remorse there in that sense.
What emotions do you feel in this moment having this conversation?
Combination of another layer of awareness for which I'm thankful, and another layer of remorse as far as missed opportunities or missed chances to be more aware earlier. So it's that sort of cup is half full, half empty at the same time.
The thing that resonates most deeply with me is how much I appreciate your willingness to become aware of it now. And I use that term intentionally now, because that to me is the word that lacks any sort of temporalness, even though the irony is we think like past, present, and future kind of a sense. Because as you were speaking about your story, the stories that conjures up for me is my mother, who was also from a family of, I think, 6. And she was the middle child. And she's now in her 70s. And there's still the same exact thing going on there. But I think when you say, I've only realized, and I'm talking about these things in my 60s, I think she's going to say, I'm only realizing this one in my 70s.
Yeah.
And for that, just the fact that you're willing to talk about this in the public eye, that to me is a huge level of courage and humility that you're embodying and modeling for the rest of humanity. And I just genuinely believe the story is in some ways universal across all culture.
I definitely think it's universal, and I don't think it's courageous. I personally think my view is it's a little bit selfish and self-serving, because I enjoy being able to get in this kind of dialogue, especially with somebody like you that is good at listening and facilitating and probing to move the discussion forward for insights to be uncovered. And yes, maybe it's courageous to do it publicly, but that, again, back to my nature, I've always been okay and a little bit naive. Like I said, people have accused me of being vulnerable. So yes, I guess that's quote unquote courageous or naive, whatever you want to say. But
is it confidence or arrogance or courageous or naivete? Tomato.
It's back to now. That's why I like the word being present.
Yes.
That to me is not a small word. It's a very large word because it does infer that now intimacy, and intimacy meaning into me see, which why would you not want to have those kind of discussions whenever you could?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for thinking of it that way.
Yeah.
That means a lot to me. So that brings us to your present most pressing relationship.
Yeah.
Where would you want that story to begin?
It began about 5 years, 3 months and 8 days ago. No, 5 days ago. I got divorced from my first wife about 8 years ago. And then had to work through that shift because it was at her request, not mine. So there was some soul searching and desert time to work through to get into a healthy place. Then I started dating again and got into Match.com, even though I was an old fart, and found that as a way to try to engage, and had a younger woman, still in my generation, but younger than me, reach out to me on Match. And it was a new experience for me because she was African-American. I'd never dated across races, but something in me was just like, why not? Why don't we try this? So bottom line is neither of us, she was also divorced. Neither of us were looking to get married. We were both pretty independent, pretty comfortable, thinking that we don't have to, we're not financially dependent, we're not emotionally dependent. We could easily envision ourselves staying single for the rest of our lives. But after about 3 years of being totally committed to each other, we got to the point of saying, maybe we will get married again. We did a couple of years ago, and now I'm 2 years into my second marriage, and now am the proud stepfather of her 10-year-old daughter that we have joint custody of. So we have her every other week. But the reason I bring it up as the third chapter is because she is African-American, and I have had the opportunity to get into a whole nother layer of understanding empathy and how it relates to systemic racism and racial injustice and trauma, cumulative, multi-generational trauma, and how much unconscious biases are just so deeply woven into our psyche that it's a lifelong journey to uncover them and try to recover from them and learn from them. You have to embrace them and first become aware of them, and then acknowledge the pain without getting stuck in the pain. Again, I grew up in a Christian, God-loving family. I had no racist views anywhere near me, but I grew up in a very Catholic white ghetto, I'll call it, just very homogeneous lens all the way through college. And I didn't have my first really personal relationship with folks that were African-American until I was in my 50s. Plenty of times at DuPont and all the rest, I was known to be as a good leader of diversity and inclusion efforts. And DuPont was pretty progressive on those things. So there was an awareness there, but very superficial.
When you say superficial, meaning?
Polite. So understanding the facts of some racial injustice history and current day disparities and all the rest, but not getting down into what's the unfiltered African Americans' view that you need to have a trusted discussion. That didn't really happen. It happened in a setting before I met her, and it's part of, it was through Ecumenical Center here that I went through a 10-month Koinonia program, it was called, and it was a mixed group of white and African-American people to get into racial issues, which are quite deep and systemic because this was the capital of the South. So it was a great 10th-month program, really get into it. But the whole point was a group of 20 of us that got into the facts and the issues, but we built relationships. and we got to know each other as genuine friends. And then when you hear about the hurts and the trauma from a multi-generational African-American perspective, you go through some really deep guilt and shame emotions because you really internalize what it means to be tolerant of a racially unjust system and culture, which is what the US has. But because you have built relationships that are based on vulnerability and trust, you had African Americans there that were not letting you off the hook. They were letting you feel the shame and the guilt, but they were also there to help you know that you were going to get through it.
How did
And
they
you
do
were
that?
able to, by listening to learn.
They were also reciprocating.
Yes.
Ah.
Yes. So it really was how you help each other through a moment of awakening by letting the hurt touch the other person, not letting them get stuck in it, letting them figure out. It's just like mourning the death of a relationship or a person that's, you got to go in the desert, and it may be for 40 days or 40 weeks. It hopefully isn't going to be for 40 years. But you will come out on the far side of it, and you come out changed. So that was the precursor to meeting my wife. But because that relationship is now the most important one in my life, I am in settings where, for the first time in my life, the only white person in a room of 30 people, and at her family reunion for Thanksgiving or whatever.
Oh, that's right.
So I get to be on the other side of their much more comfortable cultural style on things. And I'm the one that has to figure out how to adapt and interpret and all the rest. And so in the 5 years I've known her, especially the 2 years we've been married, there's just layers of unconscious biases that I now appreciate all the time. The good part of being able to have them put in your face every day is, as opposed to my very emotional reaction that I mentioned earlier in that 10-month program, where guilt and shame can almost get you frozen just because it's such a heavy feeling when you realize just how deep the trauma is and how intentional it was for the other side. Working through it makes it easier the next time, like with all these microaggressions where you've done something and it'll still trigger the guilt and shame, but especially when it's somebody you love, it's okay. Acknowledge it, work on it, try to do it better, but let's move forward. You get a chance to keep working. The analogy I use is an onion, just because you peel that first crusty layer off of unconscious bias and you're like, oh, okay, I'm all set. You think it's more like an orange. You just get one layer off and then it's a sweet, juicy fruit. But no, it's an onion. Oh, there's another layer. Oh, there's another layer. Oh, there's another layer.
What were some realizations of empathy you've had since having been part of that group and getting married and seeing your own unconscious biases unfold?
I think probably one of the biggest ones is just understanding better how multi-generational oppression in the form of racism really hardwires some very well-earned defensive mechanisms for the African Americans in society to just need the benefit of the doubt for anything that they might do, because they have just been, not in their life, but their parents' life and their parents' life and their parents' life, been told, you're nothing, don't expect anything. We have the right to, profile and accuse you of anything at any time, in any condition, in any way we just determine appropriate. So when you think of that fight and flight emotional reaction, the amygdala in your brain, which is triggered as it should be before you have any chance to use a rational brain when you're challenged, that's on all the time.
Yeah.
And I realized no wonder a natural reaction would be either accommodate and don't offend this other person, don't tell them what you're really thinking, or let them have it because they just aren't listening. And from a white privilege perspective, it's like, well, how come you're not talking to me? Because they've been taught it's never safe to talk to you. Or why are you talking so loud to me? I don't yell at you. It's because I don't have to yell to get my way. I get my way because I'm starting from the point of power. I don't have to raise my voice in the vast majority of situations. And just so anyway, there's just so many things that it's like a whole nother learning curve. So listening to learn, I get a chance now to listen, to learn and empathize in settings that I was not exposed to for the first 45 to 50 years of my life. And I'm only really exposed to now, partially because, thanks to my wife, we're committed to each other. And so sometimes she has to coach me, but most times she knows that I'm not going to be too embarrassing with how I handle a situation, but I'm getting invited into situations that I should have been in 40 years ago.
What kind of situations?
Just social settings, just a chance to see and live and understand what an African-American family enjoys and prioritizes and how they really count on each other and challenge each other and all the things that happen, but in ways that are life, but life from an entirely different lens, where you just realize that if you were in that culture and viewing the world from their perspective, you would likely behave exactly like they do.
Yeah.
So I was already a pretty forgiving person and slow to judge and condemn other people's actions. But the more I've learned to empathize, the more I've been willing to listen to learn, the more I've realized I doubt that there's any person I've ever talked to or could talk to that if I was going through what they were going through and had the background they had and had the conditions they had and had the opportunities or challenges or lack thereof that they had, that I wouldn't do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Which to me is like that ultimate of empathy, as you've brought it up. Can you empathize to how somebody got to the point of taking somebody else's life?
Yeah.
And I am a pacifist at heart. I have trouble imagining killing anybody, but I am now more than ever closer to believing I can see how another person could take somebody else's life, given what conditions they were in, what situation at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. That, not that it makes it right, but empathy is not about judgment. Empathy is about connection.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you just shared. And first of all, in making sure that I'm actually understanding the kind of situations that you're describing, it almost sounds like you're learning a new language, in the sense that you can jokingly say, like, why are you yelling? But yelling in some cultures are perceived in one way, but in another culture, it's not, right?
Right.
But if you're used to thinking of yelling as one thing, it's seemingly so fundamental and just sort of basic that how else would you possibly interpret yelling? It clearly must mean this. But then you go to a culture that's very different from yours, you realize something I thought was so basic and primitive to all human beings are challenged. Then you're like, this is a whole another level of language that I'm learning, and I cannot possibly assume I actually understand what's going on until I actually learn the language. And it just so happens that they're actually still using English, so we cannot assume that we're actually meaning the same thing. And there's a yet very fuzzy and complex whole layer of language that you're having to learn in a relatively short amount of time. Does that accurately describe what's going on?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yes, I'm okay that I am uncomfortable at times. And I know I'm going to be uncomfortable, but I'm also appreciative of actually being in a setting where I get a chance to listen, to learn. And even in COVID, there's been other more just things are made much more visceral, like the fact that my wife has a challenge of not just being African American, but being a woman. So I've had a chance to hear some of her company Zoom calls, where they're going over stuff, and I'll be overhearing it while I'm doing something. And we've had the discussion a couple of times where they'll be talking about an issue and she'll make a comment and it doesn't really get acknowledged. And then about 15 minutes later, a white guy makes the same comment, almost identical. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, David, that's a really great point, blah, 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 blah. And she'll look at me like, see? And it'll be like, oh my God, that couldn't have been scripted any more clearly than. And then I had the same thing on the reverse shoot because we got into this Zoom group, which was a group of African Americans and whites that have a Saturday morning Zoom where we just talk about race issues. And we're trying to build on this idea of building community and relationships so that we can share learnings of what the American culture is going through at this time. And some contentious topic came up about what should we do or something. And I've tried to be quiet in these and learn to not talk, but to listen. But anyway, I made a comment on something. And then about 30 minutes later, and it didn't really get any traction. And about 30 minutes later, one of the African-American women said something very similar to what I said. And I was like, oh, that's a great point, Kanisha. I mean, it was like, hey, that happened to me now. And it's kind of like, that's what I mean by it's an opportunity to not be in a classroom setting, but the real life classroom that just kind of makes unconscious biases and these facts that even if you're speaking the same language so many times without real empathy, you don't have a dialogue going on. Two monologues going on, but it's not a dialogue because you're not acknowledging the whole person.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning how I feel very appreciative of your wife in the sense that given that you're learning a new language, you're also vulnerable, right? Because I think that's also a fact of the matter. And it's not easy to learn a new language, especially when it's high stakes. Unless I learn this language, I'm not going to be able to actually fit in or belong to a community that I genuinely want to belong and want to make sure that the way I communicate does resonate and lands on these people. And it also sounds like the ecumenical group that you mentioned earlier, there is this sort of reciprocal relationship where the other person also is willing to understand what you're going through and make sure that you feel also accepted, appreciated, validated for your willingness to even try, for your willingness to venture into this unknown, because it still is an unknown world that you're venturing into.
And that's the point, Slim. To me, empathy is about that commitment to do your best to put yourself in the other person's shoes for a moment for the purpose of understanding. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. And I think that's a nuance that I know I trip on and I've seen so often trips on is if I'm empathetic, that means I got to agree. That I'm going to take up
that have to conform or something like
right.
that.
And maybe you will, but that's not a prerequisite. Yeah. Especially for white men. Again, it's just that ego thing of if I'm going to actually acknowledge what they're saying and saying, I understand their emotion, that means I'm wrong. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying. It means you're going to suspend judgment long enough to validate that the other person has the right to have an opinion.
Yes.
And you can understand the logic of their opinion based on their fears and history and culture and layers of things that they don't share with you. But that doesn't mean it's back to what is probably truly meant, but has been lost by the phrase of civil discourse. It's almost absent, unfortunately, right now, because we don't have those honest reciprocal engagements. We have a lot of flybys and then echo chambers to reinforce our immediate perspective on things instead of stepping outside and thinking, what else is there that is constructive tension on my historical perspective?
Exactly. And I think is very critical to your point when you earlier mentioned how the human relationship only formed starting with vulnerability, and then comes trust, and then the curiosity and all those things started to become amplified to a much larger degree. It sounds like the kind of the civil discourse that maybe was meant was a human discourse, not merely having a debate for the sake of finding out who is right and who is wrong, but really being vulnerable as human beings on both sides, or how many ever sides there are, and all of them being respected, appreciated, validated for the emotional content of what is actually happening. And then one of the eureka or interesting things that I think you're also alluding to is when the truth, if you will, of the emotional honesty is risen to the surface, as opposed to the superficial kind of dialogues you were mentioning earlier, new ways of actually approaching the situation oftentimes naturally emerge. And you're like, I've never thought of this situation that way. Oh, that makes complete sense. Why don't we do this? Duh. Right. But it was only obvious because the truth emerged. Until that point, when the only superficial lay, it was a muck. It was completely invisible. Does that resonate?
Oh, again, to me, that is a great description to me of the difference between the shallow standard of diversity and the deep standard of inclusion. Because to me, inclusion demands that level of humanity-based, vulnerability-enabled, trust empowered, that brings out a both and new creation. It's the power of three, two dissimilar perspectives that are able to synthesize enough to create a better,
a different whole that was unexpected. Yeah. Absolutely. What emotions do you feel at this moment?
I feel validation. Again, I put stuff out there and you've been very validating that none of it's too crazy talk. So that's always, but I just, again, I feel layers of appreciation, and I'll go back to the awe and wonder. This is why I love these kind of discussions, is if you can get away from some of the chatter and the noise and the polite talk and slow down enough to actually listen to, with, and for the other person, it's a great place.
It is. It is. And what's also implied is you grow and mature as a human being through such a process. Does that resonate?
It does. I've always enjoyed the image of a spiral, because I have seen a lot of patterns in my life of, again, learnings and things that I got to relearn again. But as long as you're learning from it, you're not spinning your wheels at one dimension. Right. You're learning. And I love a spiral just because in my image, in theory, heaven's up there. But the point's going to be, I never have the expectation that I'll have all the answers. I'll have more answers than I had yesterday, but not as many questions as I'll have tomorrow. But I am able to enjoy the journey and not get stuck on the woulda, coulda, shouldas, as much as just acknowledge them, not deny them, but not get it. That's part of life. That's as long as you're continuing to try to learn and apply, that's a good place to be.
And tying that back to the whole metaphor of learning a language, which in my mind is a journey you're on. I remember hearing about an older woman on TV who was in her 90s, and she had just started to learn English. She was Korean. And the interviewer was like, why do you bother learning English at the age of 90? And her answer was, I had the same thought when I was 60, but I said, I'm too old to learn English. So she didn't. And now she's 90. Imagine what could have happened if I had learned English for 30 years. And I think in my mind, I just cannot appreciate enough just how grateful I am for your willingness to take that step in the journey and to have the long-term vision of looking at this as a process of learning, growing, and maturing. Because in my mind, that is exactly what it is. And the trouble is when you look at it as anything else, therein comes the frustration, the guilt, the shame, and all the things that actually hamper our ability to naturally learn. So thank you so much for being who you are, Bill.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that. I think it's great that you are driving this topic of empathy, because to me, it's not a luxury. It's a prerequisite if you're going to have true relationship, true community, right? No man exists by themselves. So unless, and it's getting to be a lost art, especially with social media, because social media is not a way to drive empathy. Unless we can have a priority to be able to connect emotionally with our fellow human beings and look for that common humanity and the things we can agree on and work together on. And it doesn't have to be everything, but the things that matter most while still honoring the differences, then it doesn't matter what technology we get. It doesn't matter what money we get. It doesn't matter what nuclear warheads we have or religious fervor we have. If you can't connect with others, you're not going to move forward, and you're not going to enjoy today to the extent that you should be. It's just, it shouldn't be at the end of the list after reading, writing, and arithmetic. It should be like at the front of the list, because it's also the one that is not go through this series of steps and you get the math answer. Empathy is, and you're trying to bring out part of the science of it, but a lot of it is art. And you only learn by doing and learn by failing. I think that's part of the other challenge is you don't get it. Even if you want to be empathetic and you're trying to listen to learn, you stumble and you fall, but don't stop trying. Keep at it. Because like back to your earlier example of speaking a foreign language, which I'm terrible at because I took Latin in school. Not too many people use that. And being at DuPont, I always had a national there that was a translator. So I never bothered to learn another language. But I was going to say, I did know anytime you're in a foreign country, if you're in Japan and say arigato or whatever, even though they know that's about all you know, they love that. And I was going to make the same thing with empathy. Even when you get it wrong, if you're trying, anybody that you're trying it with is not going to be like, oh, you didn't get it right. Don't you ever try to empathize with me again. They'll be like,
oh, that'd be hilarious.
Like husband and wife. Wow, you're really trying to figure out how I feel? You didn't get it right, but thanks for the trying, right?
Absolutely. And it's one of those things where you're like, realize, finally you appreciate me. After all these years of like earning all the bread and everything, like this is the thing that you appreciate the most. Like I should have done this much earlier.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Bill, for your honesty, for your willingness to be vulnerable, and for your willingness to not stop trying and being curious. Thank you for being with us today. May you
Quite welcome.
May you stay beautiful. Bye-bye.
May we all.
Hey there, listener. Thank you for listening to the very end. I believe we can mature and innovate by navigating the difficult journey of realizing empathy in the face of tension. What I've learned from my own experience is that all of our challenges in empathizing with others is ultimately an opportunity to realize empathy with ourselves, to develop a greater understanding and appreciation of who we are and who we can be when we feel connected. And this journey is difficult. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is especially so if you go at it alone. So I envision a world where each and every one of us, from the moment we're born until the day we die, can feel certain there's at least one person we can reach out to at any given moment who can and will support us in this journey in a way that actually makes us feel supported. If you share this belief, please subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and also like and share this episode, as well as leave a review of our podcast so more people can enjoy it. And if you believe you know somebody who can be a great guest for our show, please send us email at podcast@realizingempathy.com. We absolutely love hearing from you. Thank you once again, and until next time, may you stay beautiful.